Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether and how politics should appear in our preaching this week. This is a special COP26 edition of the podcast, and I hope you'll enjoy. As you've probably noticed from either my voice or my face if you're watching on YouTube, I'm not Beth. My name is Mollie Pugmire. I'm a COP26 campaign worker for the Methodist Church in Britain. And this week, I'm going to be filling in for Beth. COP26, in case you weren't sure, is the United Nations annual climate change conference. And it is happening next in Glasgow in the first couple of weeks of November this year. The campaign that I'm working on is called Climate Justice for All, CJ4A for short. And my team is made up of young people from all over the world who are seeking to mobilise the global Methodist family on issues of climate and climate justice in the run-up to COP26. So each week, Beth is usually joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit. And today is no exception to that. So today I'm really pleased to introduce Dave Gregory. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. Hi, Mollie. Good to be with you. Yeah, I am a Baptist minister. I'm based in Croxley Green. I've been here for about 11 years now, and until recently I was team leader of the ministry team at Croxley Green Baptist Church, but actually I've just stepped down from that role. I remain on the team, but I'm only half-time now, and I spend my other half of the time on projects around science, faith and the environment, including coordinating the Baptist Uni Environment Network.
Fab. Thanks for that, Dave. And also, Dave is going to be the new host of Politics from the Pulpit from September. So it's very exciting that we get to hear from you before then.
Mollie, that's not me.
Oh, I thought that was you, Dave.
No, that's Dave over at Shrewsbury-Ness Baptist Church. Dave May.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, well, we're very excited for the new host.
I'm relieved now.
So, the first question that I wanted to ask you, Dave, this is going so well. So, politics in the pulpit, what does that mean for you in your context?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean party politics for me. I heard the story of, somebody told me the story early on when I came to Croxley Green that one Sunday morning after an election, one of the deacons was leading prayers and stood up in the church and said he gave thanks to God that the right party had been elected. So that's kind of what I try and steer away from. There are some engaged with local politics, I'm glad to say, and over the years I've had the opportunity to meet our local MPs and spend time with them one-to-one, and I've had the chance to chair various election hustings as well with MPs and candidates. That's really good. My last, we've got a new MP here since the last election, and with the Christian Aid group the other week, I had the chance of a Zoom call with him to talk about issues around justice and climate, which I found he was quite engaged with, which was really good. But I think as a minister, I've always wanted, teaching and preaching that I do on a Sunday to connect with whole life, really. So it's not just about the church program. It's not just about our internal spirituality and relationships. It has to connect with the issues that we're facing in the world. So over time, from time to time, I drop in things of wider concern. So we were doing People of Mercy a few weeks ago. That was our theme, trying to understand who we are as church after COVID. And so I spoke about the cut in the overseas age budget to 0.7 to 0.5. That's not being a people of mercy. So that, and for some of the elections in the last decade, we've run a short series just exploring some of the issues, not telling people how they should vote, but really trying to shape how they should think Christianly as we approach these things. So I'm always I'm always kind of looking at the news these days, more days on my phone than on TV, on the BBC News app, just trying to see what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about not telling people how to vote, but kind of informing people, like kind of helping shape people's idea of what they should be engaged with, because hopefully that ultimately encourages them to either to vote or be engaged with their local representatives. But yeah, I guess it's really important that as the church we don't proclaim that this is what Jesus would have voted if he was here today and that kind of stuff, because that's often really not that helpful. But saying to people, Jesus would be engaged, so we should be. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think, and to me, Jesus was engaged. You read the Gospels; he was engaged with some of the political issues of the day. But what strikes me about Jesus is that people wanted to pigeonhole him to join their cause, and he avoided that. He had his own cause, he had his own purpose, and I think that shows you how engaged he was, but not in the way people expected him to be engaged. So I've never been a person who's wanted to join a political party. I've never found that attractive. I'm not really a campaigner either. I've been on some marches around climate, but I've not really campaigned. Although I was thinking about this 30 years ago in the 80s, when I was a young Christian, when we were going through a phase where the government were implementing tax and benefit cuts, I did write to the Baptist Times, which was a newspaper at the time. I wrote a letter saying maybe we should, as Christians, we should take our tax cut, which we were going to benefit from, and take it and give it to charity to support various projects and things like that. They actually published that letter in the Baptist Times. So I think it was the last time I wrote to the Baptist Times like that.
Well, yeah, good. Yeah, sounds like maybe there is a campaigner in you, Dave. I really like what you said as well about how party politics can sometimes be really divisive, and I think that's something that we see increasingly. And one of the things that I think of when I think of Jesus and my reading of the Gospels is that if Jesus was anything, he wasn't divisive, and right. so often we can engage in political conversation around parties, and it can be really divisive and exclusionary for so many people, and that often isn't helpful, because Jesus was a man that really valued inclusivity and coming together and working together. And if we just focus on parties when we think about politics, we miss the ability to think about how we can come together, I guess. But that is really hard for some people as well, because some people are really staunchly one political party or another. But I guess trying to be the church as a people who as well are very often have lots of different opinions, we come together over issues of injustice, I would hope. And so that needs to be modelled as well when we think about politics outside of the church building as well as inside.
I think you're right about Jesus not being divisive, and I think there has to be a way of people working together on issues, even if they disagree on others. I think one of the things I encountered when I was Baptist Union president, and I kind of mixed with people across political parties, was that there was at times not a friendship there, but a sense of camaraderie together. And you found that amongst the Christians as well. There are Christians on both sides of the political spectrum. Yeah, they did have an ability to come together and recognize one another. So I think you're right. Jesus wasn't divisive. He was trying to bring people together, trying to bring people from the margins in as well. But he was challenging, and he was divisive another way. He was divisive in challenging as attitudes and things that did divide people. So I think we need to be careful when we say he wasn't divisive. I mean, one of his sayings, wasn't it? He turned the fathers against the sons and things like that. There was a divisiveness in him, and yet, it was bringing people together around that vision of God's rightness and kingdom and shalom. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the next questions I wanted to ask you, Dave, is from your context then of all the things you've sort of shared so far, what would you want us to hear is the sort of key justice issues or political events that you think are really important?
I think sometimes through my journey in ministry, some of the key justice things that I'm interested in are kind of been marginalised and in debate, really. So I do wonder sometimes if what we are interested in as Christians actually is very driven by the media in our culture. So our prayers on Sunday morning are often shaped by the headlines that we see in the news, and sometimes it's a struggle to get away with that. So this week, the headlines are all about Afghanistan. The headlines are all about the vaccine still and COVID and things like that. Interestingly, I visited Lebanon a few years ago in 2018, and it's a year since they had that devastating explosion there, which devastated parts of Beirut and have left the country on its knees. And yet that isn't making the headlines. Actually, I'm getting information from people I was in touch with in Lebanon about that, and so there are lots of issues actually which do slip down the agenda and lose our attention. And there are always things and always causes vying for our attention. In terms of, Croxley, where I live, community, actually, it's a very comfortable community here. And, some of the key issues, I think, in my context here, how do we go forward for the future? How do we provide homes for people in this area? A lot of the homes that are built are really big houses, and the kids who grow up and the young people who grow up in Croxley have no chance of staying in Croxley, this community that they've known through the years. How do we provide that? And yet at the same time, we're on the edge of London Greenbelt. How do we provide that? At the same time, protect the environment, protect the countryside around us, and so there's huge tensions over that in my locality, I think. And because we are such an affluent community, I've tried to in my ministry engage the church with some things in wider field. So we've had a long-standing historic connection with the Children's Centre in Hoxton in London, one of most we support in various ways. And I think that's really important because it opens people's eyes to a different reality that, 15, 20 miles away, people are living this kind of reality. And we actually have a food bank that operates from the church with the other churches, linked to a larger food bank in the next town, in Rickmansworth. And again, we don't have much footfall, but it's a statement of that we are engaged with these issues of poverty and people struggling to put food on the table. So there's some of the local things I think we're dealing with. Personally, over the last 20 years, I've been interested in the issue of the environment and climate change. That comes out of my professional background as a climate scientist in the past, and I translate that into ministry, part of this engaging with the world. So that's something I'm quite passionate about and engaged with. I think both in terms of climate justice, the impacts it's having around people around the world, but also in thinking how responding to that shapes our individual discipleship on a local level, the way we live our lives, the way we connect with the environment in an ethical or spiritual way as well. So that's something I'm very passionate about, and I guess that subject has waxed and waned on the public agenda. It's come up again in the last few years, but I would say between the follow on the public's agenda as they struggled with other things, collapsing economies and things like that, and it was quite low on the church's agenda as well. But I'm glad it's coming back up, and this year, especially with the COP26 conference coming up, we got a chance to use that as a vehicle to raise our voice on this as Christians and also across society as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I was just wondering, as you were speaking there, what has been in your experience, as someone who has got a base in kind of climate science and has come into ministry, what has been congregations' responses to you bringing themes of climate justice and climate science and all that kind of stuff into your kind of Sunday morning preaching, or like the church life beyond just a Sunday? I'd be really interested to hear what your experience.
I think one of my memorable experiences was in a previous church I was in when I'd done an all-age service on the environment and climate change. Now, all-age services in that churches weren't always appreciated, shall I say, by the whole church, because they didn't think it was deep enough preaching, for example. They thought it was rather than serious worship. Some people, I just saw it as a way to engage in different ways, both families, children, adults across the spectrum. So I do remember somebody coming up to me after that service, and we'd done some interesting things like give everybody a little cup with an ice cube in and get them to watch it melt, and then bring it forward on the stage and put it around a blow-up globe to show our concern about climate change and things like that. I remember somebody coming up to me on the door and said, "Why was I bothering with all this? It's just secondary. You should be preaching the gospel. People in this church need to hear the gospel." And that was an interesting reaction. That was an extreme reaction. I mean, I thought they were wrong then, and I thought they were wrong now. It didn't stop me. Other people kind of smile and nod their heads and say, "That's interesting, thank you very much," but it doesn't really impact their lives. Other people get it and start to make an interest in it. And sometimes that surprises me. So a few years ago, Lent, so I ran that in my church as a background thing through Lent, really, and it didn't seem to be that many people were engaging with it at all. And yet it was only after Lent, in the next few months, that I picked up people saying to me, "Oh, yeah, we did this in Living Lent. We gave up buying anything new. We thought about our energy usage and our energy supply." And it was across the spectrum. It wasn't everybody in the church, but it was from across the generations that had started to engage and think with it. And that was interesting that this issue was not without hope, that people were starting to engage with it again. So sometimes it's not the big things that you need to think about, it's the little things that you need to cling on to, the changes you see. I think in the last, I think amongst the Baptists, there's always been a few of us who have had an interest in this. I think that has, over the last year, that it's raised up in our understanding of what's important in terms of mission. And I mean, last night I was on a call with Baptist Union Environment Network in the Midlands, one of the regional groups that we've managed to set up in the last year. We had about 30 people on the call about how to run a Climate Sunday service and what resources are available for that. So that's really encouraging to see that growing interest amongst the Baptist community, and I hope that we can encourage that to persist as we move forward beyond COP.
Thank you. I think one of the key things that I picked up on when you said that is that we need to be not without hope, and trying to keep a hold of that as we think about the climate is really important, isn't it? Because it's so easy to be incredibly overwhelmed and feel so much anger and despair. But yeah, I think especially as Christians, we need to really try and center hope in all of these conversations, so we move forward in a way that we hope we can do better, as opposed to kind of wallow and despair in what we see, which is really easy to do.
And I know there's a lot of there's some anxiety out there as well, and that's why hope's important. I
definitely
remember was part of wisdom year. year sixes to year 4 to year 6 in a town just north of where we are. And I was talking to this group of environmental champions from these primary schools about climate change, and the head teacher, one of the head teachers emailed in the organizer the day before, and I said, what are you going to say to these children? Because they're already anxious enough. And they were worried about us raising their anxiety level. And I was, before the summer, a few months ago, I was in a secondary school, and I asked the children, the young people in year 10 actually, if they're anxious about climate change. And some stood up and some didn't. And the most memorable question, most memorable response to me was somebody, a young girl, who said, I've got things anxious about, I just can't. And it shows you there's a level of anxiety anyway in the younger generations, as well as this, some of them are very about climate change, who are very engaged with the subject and want to do something about it. But I think hope counters that anxiety, actually. We need to, and I think the gospel, what Jesus has to say, does give us all the negativity that we see, that it is possible for us to do something about it. And I think that's a message actually the campaigning groups are trying to get across. There is still hope. There is still hope of reaching 1.5 degrees, limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees. There's certainly a bigger hope of limiting it to 2 degrees. But I think that's a message that we need to keep sharing with people. And I think the gospel, the Christian faith, does give us good reason for that hope for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm just going to move us on to one of our next sections. So as usual, our friends at JPIT have put together a small roundup of some of the things to keep an eye on this week. So they want you to know that their season of creation resources are out, and they can be found on the JPIT website. There are loads of different resources to help people reflect and lead worship and prayer on creation. And if your worship service follows the revised common lectionary, you will find that some of the items are based around the readings for each Sunday of the season of creation during 2021. Other items are undated and appropriate for use at any time, so do check those out. Likewise, JPIT's COP26 hub can be found on their website and points towards many of the major church initiatives, resources, prayers and events happening around COP26 and in the run-up. And they also wanted me to mention, obviously, the devastating situation in Afghanistan, the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is making it much harder for refugees to come to the UK, the earthquake in Haiti last week, and ongoing wildfires and extreme weather in Europe, America, and all around the world, really. So do keep looking out for news on those. So now that we've thought a little bit about the news, I'm going to invite us to open up our Bibles and to move on to the readings, which today come from Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 8 to 13, James chapter 1, verses 17 to 27, and Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 8, 14 to 15, and 21 to 23. So, let's just jump right in. Dave, I'm going to start by asking you, where would you start? And is there anything in particular that jumps out to you about any of these readings?
I have to say that being a Baptist, we're not that very lectionary driven in our preaching. So actually having to think about lecture is quite good, actually. Gives you a broader scope on things. I also have to confess that I don't think I've ever preached from the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs. Sunday morning, I've heard it. I think I've things and I've used in weddings, but it's not to preach on really. So having to engage with it is not a challenge, but it's gives you some fresh ground to work with. I think when I read this passage, what came to mind is that I think I've been rather more honest with this book in the last couple of generations. That traditionally it's all seen as a conversation between Christ and the church. That's how the church has dealt with material. But I think more recently we've acknowledged that actually this is a passionate love poem, really. And I don't think we need to shy away from that. I think these kind of emotions, this kind of experience is just part of the breadth of human life. It's who humans are made to be, and that's part of how God has made us. But I think when I read it and thinking about the context of the climate conference and the environment, I think I wanted to come back to that conversation between Jesus, God, and the church in a sense. What strikes me as well, and it strikes me more and more as I read the Bible, is how much creation imagery is used to express this conversation, to express ideas and concepts and ways of life. So this Song of Solomon is just abounding with this creation imagery, and excuse me, and it starts with that phrase, doesn't it? Listen, my beloved, look. It has this call to be attentive to what, not only what God is saying actually, but actually what God is showing us in the world, showing us in creation. And maybe that's a feature of that's an experience people have had in the last months. I think we've become much more aware of creation around us. And I've thought this for a long time, I've experienced it for a long time as well, that as you look actually at creation, God speaks. It doesn't just speak about the wonder of creation, but just like the parables where Jesus used kind of agricultural imagery, nature imagery in teaching, actually, I think God can speak through creation. So what strikes me about this passage, putting that lens on it, it's almost like God is calling to us through creation to look and be attentive to his being, his character, his way of life, his kingdom. So that's this passage for me, really. And I've been to Scotland recently. I've had a week in Fort William. I've had a week staying in a little bungalow where I could come out in the morning and have my breakfast and look up at Ben Nevis. And watch all the little people walking up it, these little dots of people walking up the zigzag path. And we were one of them one day. We walked up Ben Nevis one day. But one morning, I came into the kitchen and it looked into some woodland over an old stone wall. And as I looked that morning into the kitchen, there was the deer and its foal, just really. And in verse 9 it says, "Look, my love is like a gazelle or a young stag. Look, he stands behind our wall, gazing through the window." And that was my experience on a couple of mornings. Gazing over the wall, this nature, this beautiful. And again, it just says, look, listen, be attentive. About our lives, about the world through creation. So that there were some of the things that started to come out as I engaged and started to look at this passage. Really, the call to be attentive to creation as we think about the way our lives, our planet, other people's lives are changing.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was going to note as well, that need to be attentive and to almost just stop and see what is around us and appreciate that for what it is. And I would also agree with what you said about, I guess over the last year, we've tend to have done that a little bit more intentionally because life has looked a little bit different. But yeah, that being as well, those kind of like images of nature and the beloved being like a gazelle or a young stag, and kind of like reminding us of the way in which we are also a part of creation and we are not something separate, but something that surrounds us, and that we need to kind of hold more closely and dearly because God holds creation closely and dearly. And that is obviously, if it's important to God, it's important to us. And yeah, those images of springtime and kind of new life as well, I think is lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, going back to what you just said about connecting with creation, I think one of the things that struck me in the last 6 months, I was reading a book on sabbatical earlier in the year called Bible and Ecology by Richard Balcombe. And he talks about the community of creation and humans being part of the community of creation. And, often as Baptists, we and as Christians, the church is the community of God in a sense. Yeah, in a real sense, the body of Christ. But I've been playing around with the idea, actually, what happens if creation is the body of Christ, the community of creation? How does that change the way we look at our relationship with people and the world around us here? And I don't think this passage just speaks about appreciation either, because you get beautiful calendars, don't you, with lovely scenes on that we have in our kitchens and offices. That's about appreciating it. But this is a call to action as well, because as well as that listen and look, there's that in verses 10 and 13, it says, "Arise, come my darling." There's all, but there's a response to what you're seeing, a journey with God. And that's a phrase that comes twice, doesn't it? In verse 10 and verse 13, and sandwiched between them is this description of nature. The winter is past, the rains are gone, flowers appear on the earth. Like you say, this new life bursting forth in spring. And this phrase, "Arise, my darling, come with me." And it's a vision of the new life of God, creation. It's a vision of abundance there, but is it abundance for our sake, or is it just abundance for its own sake? This is the way the world is. This is what God values, this fruitfulness. And maybe, as we were saying earlier, this is a vision of hope in creation. The transition from winter to spring is a moment of hope, isn't it? Winter's not dead. It's full of life. We're just not so aware of it. But there is certainly an eruption of life this spring. I took a series of photographs of my garden this spring every Friday morning from January to March and onwards. And you put it as a photo montage together. You see the barrenness coming towards spring, this abundance of life coming up. I think that gives us a vision of God's heart for creation, this abundance that he's placed in creation, which I think he revels over for its own sake, but actually provides for us. And maybe there is a call there to us to say we need to be aware of how we protect this abundance, how we play our part with God in sustaining this abundance. And maybe that's part of this call to action that this passage kind of speaks into this moment for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what you said about it has to be more than just appreciation. And if we appreciate creation without a response and without action, then I think we're doing such a disservice as well to creation. Because if we can acknowledge its beauty and its value and what it can provide for us, but we do nothing to protect it, when we know that we are detrimentally impacting it as a whole, that's such a disrespect, isn't it, to creation, and I guess to the creator as well. So yeah, I think it's really important for us in the church as well to remember that that appreciation has to come with action. Otherwise, it's appreciation in vain, isn't it? I guess to an extent of it's quite, I guess, arrogant to assume that we can appreciate it, but we do nothing to protect and kind of want to see it at its most full and beautiful, really.
Yeah. And I think that takes you beyond that. You ask me what response do I get? Some people say, "Well, that's very nice," but in some ways, I think as a preacher, I get fed up of people saying to me on the door, "Oh, thank you very much, very nice this morning." Yeah, I don't want to hear. It's nice to be affirmed like that, but I want to also say to them, what difference did it make?
Yeah.
maybe my preaching is not good enough for people to make a difference. I don't know, but that's at my heart. I want to make a difference to people, and I think it goes beyond appreciation to some kind of action. And yeah, and maybe, I mean, going on to the James passage, if we can.
Yeah, of course.
That starts with that call to action, doesn't it? You know, do not merely listen. You know, do not merely be attentive, but do what it says to the word. Do what it says, really. A week or so back, I sat in on the press conference to the launch of the IPCC Working Group 1 climate science report, the latest kind of summary of the climate science. And one of the kind of organisers of, the servants who organised that process, it's slightly said to camera, she said, I mean, this is the 6th report in 30 years. And I was working at the Hadley Centre when the first couple of ones came out, and I had friends very engaged with that. And she said, this lady said, you scientists have spoken for 30 years, but we have not listened. And now climate change is with us. And I found that heartbreaking in some ways, because I mean, they talk about this new report suggesting an urgency, an increasing urgency. Personally, I think that urgency was there in the first report. But actually, really action we need to take.
Sorry, Dave. I think we lost you slightly after you said the urgency was there after that first report. I don't want people to miss what you said.
No, I was just saying. So I think that, to me, James emphasises this need to respond, to do something, to do what it says, to act practically in our own lives as churches and actually as society, to make a difference to the way things are going.
Yeah. When I was reading the James passage as well, thinking about that need to act and respond, I also was struck by some of the things that was said, and I think can be really usefully applied to our conversations around the climate. It says everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak. And I think what I found from my work, obviously I do a lot of working with young people from all across the world in different countries, and their experiences of the climate crisis are vastly different depending on where they live and things like that. And one of the things that I found is so important for church communities, particularly in the global north, especially for us here in Britain, that when we think about the climate crisis and our response to it, we really need to be very quick to listen and very slow to speak, because I've learned so much from listening to my colleagues and other people that we've spoken to over this last year, and realize the wisdom that comes with being, I guess, a climate expert by experience, because you've lived the reality, and that has to be really central to our action, that we do listen and we remember that it isn't just about acting to save ourselves in the future, but thinking about the ways in which communities all over the world are being impacted by the climate crisis today. Yeah. And they have been trying to tell us that, but we just maybe not want to listen, wanted to listen because, for obvious reasons, that we just don't want to engage, because we don't want to admit, one, that there is a problem, and two, maybe admit that we are very much part of that problem and perpetrators in that.
I think that what you said there about listening, as it says, quick to listen, slow to speak, that kind of goes back to that attentiveness as well, doesn't it? Not only an attentiveness to creation, what God's saying to us through creation, but an attentiveness is what God is saying to us through people. Because you're right, there are many people around the world for whom climate change is a lived experience. Perspective in the location we live in the world, we don't see yet we don't necessarily see the heat waves, the forest fires, the floods so dramatically as some of our brothers and sisters people who live in the developing worlds, in the south, in some of the more marginal places on the earth. They're already living this out. One of the things I've spoken about and wrote about is that we've all been traumatized by the COVID experience over the past year. And we have thrown around in our campaigning climate emergency. But to us, actually, in our experience, it doesn't feel like an emergency. COVID felt like an emergency. But the climate doesn't feel like an emergency. And yet, for some people in the world, the climate crisis is really just a bigger climate emergency as COVID was for us. And I think that's, we need to listen to that in their lives. But we have been slow to listen. And even if we've listened, facing up to the changes it might call upon our lives to make a difference to their life now and in the future. And change is really hard. And the things that we do to push, the climate to change, to cause the climate change, are very ingrained into the way we all live our lives, the way we buy things, we use energy, we use things. And it's difficult, actually, to make those practical changes in our lives that will make that longer term difference in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I totally hear what you said about the way in which we've experienced what I guess a country and a government declares an emergency is over the last year. We've seen with COVID that what it means to really take action when we hear emergency, and obviously that's been to varying different degrees over the last 12 months and further back than that, really. But yeah, you're so right. I've heard a lot of campaigners talk about, okay, well, if we've asked our governments to declare a climate emergency, how have they responded in anything more than just saying, yeah, we agree? And I guess that's really important, isn't it? Because so much of what we talk about when we talk about especially countries like Britain is how do we make sure that we do more than just say we're going to do things and declare things and say we stand in solidarity with you, we accept that this has happened, but actually make the really difficult changes to ensure that we're not continuing the mistakes that we've been historically and presently making around the climate. And I guess dignifying people in a way that says, okay, you've told us your lived experience, we've seen it, and we're going to act as if that really, really matters to us, as opposed to it being a kind of something that we can just turn our eyes away from, really.
And I think you've seen that in the global political sphere as well. So, Paris 2015, the Paris Accord, nations said they would commit to 1.5. Well, they'd commit to 2. They'd strive for 1.5 degree, limit their warming to 1.5 degrees, and they'd all submit their plans to reduce their carbon emissions over the years. The plans that have been submitted to the process is only going to limit the warming to 2.5 to 3 degrees. Now, that means actually when we go on to COP26 this year, we really need to see nations ramping up their commitments to over the next decade, actually, to make a huge cut in their climate emissions, especially the developed world, to give space for the developing world to make adaptation and changes. And we do. Again, we don't need to say it. And part of the reason we want to do it is we need to listen to these voices who are being impacted upon that. But we find that so hard to do. So that needs to be one of that's in some ways that's why there is a value in using the phrase climate emergency, but it does need to be backed up by action. And I think in our prayers, in our campaigning, in our speaking over the next couple of months, and actually into the years ahead, we need to be stressing this need for action.
Yes, absolutely.
To put our actions where our words have been. And I think that needs to go beyond COP26, because they're going to make their promises there, and then we need to hold them to account, to be honest. We need to make sure they do what they say they're going to do. And actually, as individuals, because what struck me about this passage as well, it's a very personal passage. It's written to a community, and yet it's very personal language. Anyone, whoever, that's individual language. We too need to make a commitment to walk in step commitments, or even faster than the corporate commitments the nations are going to make, particularly as Christians. So.
Yes, and something that I've found with my work is that it's really important that we call upon our political representatives to say, this is what we want you to do, but being able to mirror and match that with, and in our church community, we're going to make these changes because we understand and we appreciate that everyone at all levels need to make changes, and we're going to kind of humbly walk alongside as we make changes and we find things difficult, but we want to do that because we care. And that's really significant. And that's why we're really hoping that communities kind of see the power that they have and the agency that they have to make changes, but to also send that really powerful message to leaders that we can change in our small community. Why can't we do that nationally and globally and that kind of stuff? And that is really significant.
I think at the end of this, James, the poor and the orphan, doing right by them. The religion that our Father accepts as pure and faultless is to look after the orphans and the widows in their distress. And again, that does not come back to those people who are impacted by climate change and this them and responding to them, matching God's compassion and heart for poor and we see so much in Jesus' own ministry as well.
Yeah.
So we're going back to again.
Yeah, it always feels like it comes back around to a lot of similar kind of ideas because they're so fundamental when we are trying to think about climate and things like that. So yeah, I feel we should probably. Sorry, Dave, go for it.
Sorry, what? So you broke up then? That's one of these, sorry, internet failed. What did you say then, Mollie?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said at the end there, so you go ahead and say what you wanted to say.
I wonder if we ought to move on to Mark 7, because I think there's a contrast in Mark 7 to what we just said. Yeah, we've been talking about action, but in some ways I think Mark 7 says where does action has to come from? Because this is a passage, the Pharisees criticized Jesus because the disciples not washing their hands. The disciples are not being COVID secure in their hygiene practices, shall we say, if you want to kind of give it a modern twist on that. But Jesus said, look, it's not about what you do outwardly. Actually, you've got to think about where that originates from. What's your motivation on the inside? Because it's not what you do outwardly that makes you clean, it's actually what flows from you. He says to the Pharisees, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. We can ban, but at the heart of it has to come a change on the inside of us and attitudes of heart and mind. That's the more firmer change is going to come from. And a lot of the things that Jesus talks about in this passage, things like theft, murder, greed, envy, arrogance, they are kind of all wrapped up in some of the causes of how we got into this position with the climate and the environment. You could speak about all of those things in the way we treat the environment and creation around us. We take from it without giving back to it. People, it's wrapped up around greed and envy and arrogance that we thought we could use creation just as we for us, nature, and a lot of these things need dealing with in our lives individually as corporately, and maybe that's something this passage is re-emphasizing when it comes to dealing with these issues around the environment and again, that's why, I mean, it involves a repentance, a turning around, really. And I guess that's what, at the end of the day, lots of issues of justice need in our lives, a turning around to God's way of thinking. I've been reading a couple of books. This thinking, how do we change? How do we change our mind? How do we change the focus of what we think discipleship is about? How do we bring the issues in the environment into the core of our discipleship? And I think, I'm not sure yet, but I read a novel. A friend of mine who recommended a book to me when I was on holiday with them a few weeks ago called Overstory. It's my friend Dave is very into trees. His works in the area of sustainability. He was very involved in sustainable development goals, and he recommended this book called Overstory by Richard Powers, which won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. And it's about trees, about 10 individuals who have connections through trees, and how they are trying to protect trees in a sense. Some of them are real campaigners, eco warriors, chaining themselves to the upper branches of redwood trees so they can't be chopped down and things like this. Sadly, going gradually towards ecoterrorism because of their frustration and failure of what they've been able to achieve. And in some ways, at the end of it, deciding what they'd done had achieved nothing. And yet there are other strands in this story which are about more subtler changes to people and more subtle ways of influencing people. And book, it ended rather abruptly, too abruptly for me. There was no kind of resolution in it, and I hate books like that. But it does make you think. It made me think. I wonder if the author was trying to say, well, trees are important. We need to value trees. But at the end of the day, what's the most effective way to bring that about? Is it this outward action, or is it a change of inner attitude? I just wondered about that. And then earlier in the year on sabbatical, strangely, and it wasn't expected when I started my journey at sabbatical. I say journey sabbatical because it was during lockdown, so it was mainly staying locally, walking around where I live. And we have a lot of trees here, but trees became quite a feature of my sabbatical. And one morning in a prayer week, I had a thought popped into my mind about a book that somebody had bought me about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was a really strange book for them to buy me, because this person was normally buying you very Christian books to read. They lend their books to the minister for them to read as well, which sometimes is a blessing and sometimes it's not. But this is a little book by a French author called The Man Who Planted Trees. And it's a very thin book. You can read it in an hour. And God brought this back to mind during my sabbatical. And I think the most significant thing in this book is what is on page 1. And I wrote it down because it's a quote. Let me find the book. This is the book. The Man Who Planted Trees by Jean, I can't even pronounce that in French, Giano or something. It's about a shepherd who in his daily life went around planting acorns and other seeds of trees and transformed a barren valley over 20 years into a verdant forest, but nobody knew who'd done it. And this is the opening paragraph of the book. For a human character to reveal truly exceptional qualities, one must have the good fortune to be able to observe its performance over many years. If this performance is devoid of all egoism if it is guiding motives, unparalleled generosity, if it is absolutely certain that there is no thought of recompense and that, in addition, it has left its visible mark upon the earth, then there can be no mistake. This isn't a book by a Christian author, and yet there's something very rich in that description of this shepherd who's the main character in the story that connects, I think, with what we would value as Christians, as the way God would act on the outside as well. And so when we're talking about the climate, I think as well as all the campaigning, as all the speaking and writing and encouraging people to engage with it, I think there is this necessary change of inner attitudes that actually we need to take a journey with God on as well. And maybe that takes us back to Song of Solomon again, the call of God through creation, in a sense, this deeper connection with the world that God has and provide for us, but actually has value on its own. Maybe that's part of that journey. We need to go at connecting again, that changes on the inside, that enables this activity, which is going to need to be sustained over the next decade and beyond, to a new way of living. Maybe that's part of where it starts.
Well, on that really, I guess, powerful note and hopefully very inspiring note, we should probably wrap up our conversation. So, Dave, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and chatting to me this morning for our podcast, and also to the listeners. Thank you so much to everyone who's listened. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation and found it inspiring and hopefully thought-provoking and challenging as well. If you did enjoy this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review. And yeah, please share the podcast with your friends as well. We would love to hear your thoughts on the podcast. And obviously we've been talking about climate and COP26. So this might be a podcast that might stay relevant in the run up to COP26 in terms of being able to recommend with friends and things like that. So please do keep sharing it. And so just to finish, I'm going to read a blessing. So please join me as I read this. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.
Amen.